The tomb was empty, but my soul was full, of questions, of pain, of a calling that seemed greater than I could bear. All I knew was that he had trusted me to carry a message that would change the world. My name is Mary Magdalene, and this is the truth that many have tried to silence. It is the story that has never been told, not just about Jesus, but about love, faith, and the weight of carrying a memory that the world tried to erase. It is not just about the woman the world judged, but about who I was beside Jesus, as a disciple, a witness, and something more that words might not capture. How could it be possible that, after all I had witnessed, there were still doubts about what had truly happened? The dawn was cold. The air carried the scent of damp earth as I walked slowly toward the tomb. I held a jar of oil with as much care as if it were a fragment of my remaining hope. Each step was heavy, as if the rocky path had become a maze with no way out. When I reached the tomb, an unexpected sight paralyzed me. The stone that sealed it had been moved. For a moment, I thought I had made a mistake. I looked around, searching for any sign that this was normal, but everything felt surreal. I ran to the entrance and looked inside. It was empty. The jar fell from my hands and shattered on the ground. My heart raced as hot tears streamed down my face. "They took him," I whispered, my voice heavy with despair. "Why can't they leave him in peace?" My blurred vision from the tears was interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned abruptly, trying to hold back my sobs. A man stood there. The dawn light surrounded his figure in an almost heavenly way. "Sir," I began, my voice trembling, "if you took him away, tell me where he is. I will take him back." He looked at me, his eyes filled with an inexplicable serenity. And then he spoke. "Mary." My name, spoken in such a familiar, intimate way, seemed to cut through the silence around me like a blade. My heart stopped, and for a moment, the whole world disappeared. It was him. I knew. "Rabbi," I exclaimed, running toward him, but he gently raised his hand, stopping me. "Do not touch me," he said, his voice calm yet firm. "I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." I stood frozen as he moved away, his figure disappearing into the light. The impossible had just happened. He was alive. I ran back to where the disciples were gathered. My hands trembled as I pushed open the door, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might explode. They were sitting in silence, dejected, their faces marked by grief. "He is alive," I announced, my voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I saw him. He spoke to me." Peter stood up, frowning. "What are you talking about, Mary?" "Jesus," I replied, my breath still uneven. "He appeared to me. He told me to tell you that he is going to the Father." Murmurs began to fill the room. Peter crossed his arms, his face hardened. "You must be imagining things," he said, his voice filled with skepticism. "The pain is clouding your mind." "I know what I saw," I retorted, my voice firm. "He called me by name. He sent me to you." John seemed to ponder. "What if she's right?" he asked, looking at Peter. "Jesus always did the unexpected. If he had been resurrected, he would have come to us, not to her," Peter replied with conviction. His words were like a blow, but I stood my ground. "Maybe he came to me because he knew I would believe," I shot back, staring at him. "Because he knew I would listen." The silence that followed was thick, but I didn't let it shake me. He had trusted me, and that was all that mattered. That night, while everyone sat in silence, my mind traveled back to the day I first met him. Before that, my life had been a desert. In Magdala, I was a marked woman, seen as possessed, someone carrying the burdens of the world with no hope of relief. I remember that night clearly. The square was full, lit by torches as people whispered about the new rabbi. I saw him from a distance. He was unlike the other men. There was something in his presence that seemed to repel the darkness. When our eyes met, I felt a chill. He walked toward me, while the people around stepped back. "Mary," he said, his voice as firm as it was gentle. I thought he would judge me, as everyone else did. But he extended his hand. "Be free," he said. It was as if something inside me broke. The voices that tormented me ceased. For the first time in years, I could breathe. I fell to my knees, not out of weakness, but because I knew he was different. From that moment on, I followed him. Not because I wanted miracles, but because he had given me something no one else could, hope. However, my presence in the group was not always welcomed. Peter, in particular, seemed bothered. He rarely spoke to me, and when he did, it was with a tone of distrust. "Why is she always by his side?" I once overheard Peter ask John. Jesus, however, never hesitated to include me. He looked at me as if he saw something that I couldn't even understand. His actions were clear. I had a role to play. Now, facing the doubts of Peter and others, these memories gave me strength. I knew my task didn't depend on their acceptance. Jesus had trusted me, and I would not fail. Traveling with Jesus was like witnessing the collision of two worlds. On one side, there were miracles that transcended human understanding. He healed lepers with a touch, fed crowds with what seemed like nothing, and restored hope to those who had given up on life. On the other side, there were the reactions of the powerful men, who saw him as an ever-growing threat. We moved between the faith of the crowds and the hostility of religious and political leaders. I observed everything closely, absorbing every word and gesture. But even among the disciples, there was a division I couldn't ignore. My presence in the group had always been a point of tension, especially with Peter. He seemed to see me as an intruder, someone who didn't belong there. One night, we sat around a campfire. The desert breeze blew cold, mixing with the smell of roasted fish. Jesus sat silently, contemplative, while the others discussed one of the parables he had told earlier. "She's always here," I heard Peter murmur to James, his voice low but full of frustration. "As if she were one of us." I swallowed hard. His words were like thorns, but it wasn't the first time I had heard something like that. Before I could respond, Jesus lifted his eyes. He didn't speak immediately, but when he finally did, his voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Peter," he began, his expression calm but serious. "Who are the guests at the Father's banquet? Only the strong? Only those who have always been at the table?" Peter hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "No," he replied reluctantly. "The banquet is for all." "Then why do you insist on limiting who is by my side?" Jesus continued. "Those who bear more scars have more to teach about healing." The silence that followed was heavy. Peter looked away, visibly disturbed. The other disciples stayed quiet, avoiding involvement. I held my ground, but inside, I felt a wave of gratitude. Jesus always defended me, even when the words weren't spoken directly. That night, while the others slept, I stayed awake, gazing at the stars. The journey was exhausting, but moments like that reminded me why I was there. He saw something in me, something the world tried to deny. And that was enough to keep going. The day of Jesus' arrest began with an eerie calm. The sky was clear, the air warm, but there was a tension in the air I couldn't explain. When the soldiers came, everything happened too quickly. Shouts, running, and before I could understand, he was already being taken away. I followed them to the court, keeping a safe distance, but close enough to hear the judgment. Pilate seemed hesitant, as if he knew condemning him was unjust, but lacked the courage to defy the crowd calling for blood. When he asked if they should release Jesus or Barabbas, the choice of the crowd was like a blow. They preferred to save a thief. The sound of the scourging was something I will never forget. Each lash made my body tremble. I wanted to scream, run to him, but I knew it would be useless. Even so, our eyes met for a brief moment. In his eyes, there was pain, but also something deeper, a serene acceptance of everything that was happening. When he was forced to carry the cross, I felt as though I was carrying the weight with him. His legs faltered, and he fell once, twice. Each fall was like a stab to my heart. I wanted to run to help, but the soldiers pushed me back. All I could do was follow him at a distance, unable to ease his pain. At Golgotha, the worst happened. They laid him on the cross and nailed his hands and feet. The sound of the hammer echoed in the silence, piercing my soul. I tried to look away, but the sound, the smell of blood, and the weight of the moment were impossible to ignore. When they raised the cross, I looked at him. His eyes, despite everything, met mine. There were no words, but in that instant, I felt as though he was telling me not to give up. It was a silent connection, but powerful. The following hours were the longest of my life. The people around mocked him, while I struggled to hold back tears. When he finally said, "It is finished," and breathed his last, something inside me broke. The sky darkened, as if the entire universe was in mourning. I stayed there until his body was taken down and placed in the tomb. The others had left, but I couldn't pull away. I sat near the entrance, looking at the place where he had been laid. That night, I tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. All that was left were memories of his voice, his teachings, his presence. And the question that tormented me, what if that was truly the end? The next morning arrived with soft light and a cool breeze. The world seemed unervingly quiet, as if holding its breath. I walked to the tomb with hesitant steps, holding the jar of oil in my trembling hands. It was a simple task, but to me, it was a final gesture of love for the one who had transformed my life. As I approached, my heart stopped. The stone sealing the tomb had been moved. For a moment, I thought I had made a mistake, that I was at the wrong tomb. But then I ran to the entrance and looked inside. It was empty. I felt my legs give way. The jar slipped from my hands, shattering on the ground. "They took him," I whispered, my voice broken with despair. "Why can't they leave him in peace?" As the tears streamed down, I heard footsteps behind me. I quickly turned, wiping my eyes with the sleeves of my tunic. A man stood there, his figure bathed in the dawn light. He seemed to be the gardener. "Sir," I began, my voice trembling, "if you took him away, tell me where he is. I will take him back." He didn't respond immediately. His eyes met mine, and then he spoke. "Mary." It was him. My name on his lips was unmistakable. My heart raced, and for a moment, the world around me disappeared. It was as if all the doubts and pains were swept away by that single moment. "Rabbi," I exclaimed, running toward him, but he gently raised his hand, stopping me. "Do not touch me," he said, his voice serene, yet full of authority. "I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go and tell my brothers, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." I stood frozen as he began to move away. His figure seemed to dissolve into the light, leaving me alone with an impossible certainty: he was alive. I ran back to where the disciples were gathered. My hands trembled as I pushed open the door. They were sitting in silence, their expressions still marked by mourning. "He is alive," I announced, my voice loud and firm. "I saw him. He spoke to me." Peter stood up immediately, frowning. "What are you talking about, Mary?" "Jesus," I replied, my breath still uneven. "He appeared to me. He told me to come to you and say that he is going to the Father." Murmurs began to fill the room, but Peter crossed his arms, shaking his head. "You must be imagining things," he said, his tone cold. "The pain is clouding your mind." "I know what I saw," I retorted, my voice stronger now. "He called me by name. He sent me to you." John seemed to reflect. "What if she's right?" he asked, looking at Peter. "Jesus always did the unexpected. If he had been resurrected, he would have come to us, not to her," Peter replied, his voice full of skepticism. His words were a blow, but I held my ground. "Maybe he came to me because he knew I would believe," I said, staring at him. "Because he knew I would listen." The silence that followed was heavy. I knew I would face resistance, but that didn't matter. He trusted me, and that was all I needed. Even with my testimony, doubt lingered in the air. Peter, especially, seemed determined to discredit everything I said. His rejection wasn't just aimed at me, but at what I represented, a deviation from what he believed to be the natural order. As the others debated, I began to sift through the manuscripts we had collected during our journeys with Jesus. They were stored in baskets, rolled up and forgotten amidst the chaos of the past days. Among them, I found something different, a small scroll carefully rolled, with handwriting I immediately recognized. My heart raced as I unrolled the scroll. The words written there were clear. "Mary, you are more blessed than the other disciples. For you have seen with your own eyes and understood with your heart. To you, I entrust the truths that cannot be spoken publicly, for your spirit is strong and your faith is greater than fear." My hands trembled as I read. He had written this for me. It was a confirmation of what I had always known. He saw something in me that others couldn't understand. But it was also a burden. These words weren't just recognition, they were a responsibility. The next morning, I showed the scroll to Joanna and Susanna. They read it in silence, their expressions heavy with reverence. "This changes everything," Joanna finally said. "Yes," I replied, holding the scroll tightly. "But it will also bring trouble. Peter already refuses to accept that I was chosen to carry the message of the resurrection. Imagine what he will say about this." "So what will you do?" Susanna asked, her voice full of concern. "I will show them all," I responded, my voice firm. "They need to know, even if it means facing more resistance." As I prepared to share the scroll with the group, I felt the weight of my task like never before. But there was something stronger than fear, the certainty that he had trusted me. And I would not disappoint him. I knew that revealing the scroll to the group would be a turning point. The small scroll that Jesus had written for me was more than words. It was proof of his trust and his vision of the kingdom. However, I also knew it would be met with resistance, especially from Peter. He had doubted me from the beginning, and this would only escalate the tension. That afternoon, I called the disciples together for a meeting. Joanna and Susanna stood by my side, their presence a silent reminder that I was not entirely alone. As I entered the room, I felt all eyes fall on me. Peter was seated in a corner, his face hard and closed off. He already seemed to know I had something to say. "Thank you for coming," I began, my voice heavy with determination, yet still hesitant. "There's something you need to see. Something Jesus wrote." "More stories, Mary?" Peter asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What are your inventions this time?" I took a deep breath, trying to ignore the attack. I unrolled the small scroll, holding it carefully. "These are not my words. They are his." The murmurs ceased, and the room fell into silence as I began to read. "Mary, you are more blessed than the other disciples. For you have seen with your own eyes and understood with your heart. To you, I entrust the truths that cannot be spoken publicly, for your spirit is strong and your faith is greater than fear." When I finished, I lifted my eyes to face the group. The tension was palpable. John seemed thoughtful, but Peter was visibly upset. "This is impossible," Peter said, standing abruptly. "Jesus would never have written something like this. He trusted us, the men who followed him from the beginning. Not you. And what if he trusted me because he knew I would understand something you can't, Peter?" I retorted, my voice calm, but firm. "What if he saw in me a strength that you refuse to accept?" Peter shook his head, his face red with anger. "This is an affront. You're dividing this group with your lies." "These words are not mine," I responded, lifting the manuscript. "You can reject them, but you cannot deny what is here. Jesus trusted me. And that doesn't lessen the trust he had in you." John finally broke the silence, his voice measured. "Peter, maybe we should listen. Jesus always challenged our expectations. He knew the kingdom was bigger than the norms we followed." Peter didn't answer, but his rigid posture said it all. He left the room without looking back. The rest of the disciples stayed silent, visibly uncomfortable. When the meeting ended, I sat next to Joanna and Susanna, feeling the weight of the moment. "You knew it would be like this," Joanna said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "I knew," I replied, holding the manuscript in my hands. "But that doesn't make it easier." The days that followed were marked by isolation. Peter avoided any interaction with me, and the other disciples seemed divided. John was the only one who approached, trying to understand what the manuscript meant. But I knew my presence had become a source of tension for the group. That's when I decided to leave. Not out of fear, but because my mission was bigger than that room. Jesus had preached about a kingdom without borders, and I knew there were other communities that needed to hear his message. Before I left, I entrusted the manuscript to Joanna. "Keep this," I asked. "One day, someone will need it. I don't know when, but I know it will be important." My travels took me to distant villages, places where people spoke of Jesus as an almost mythical figure. I shared his words, his miracles, and my own story. At first, many doubted me. A woman preaching about the kingdom of God was something few could accept. But slowly, I began to see hearts change. In a small village, an elderly woman held my hand and asked, "Do you think he really sees us? Us, women? Do we have a place in this too?" I squeezed her hand and smiled. "I know he sees," I answered. "He saw me when no one else did. And he sees you too." My journey was solitary, but it was also full of purpose. With every person who heard the message of Jesus and found hope, I felt I was fulfilling what he had asked of me. Yet there were still nights when the longing and the weight of all that had happened consumed me. Now, as I write these words, I feel his presence stronger than ever. I don't write to be remembered. I write so no one forgets that the kingdom of God is for all, men and women, rich and poor, saints and sinners. I write so future generations will know that his message transcends all the barriers we try to impose. When I finish, I look up at the sky. The dawn is coloring the horizon with shades of orange and gold. I take a deep breath and feel peace. I know my story doesn't end here. It will live on in all who believe in the love and faith he taught us. As you reflect on the extraordinary courage and faith of Mary Magdalene, why not take a deeper journey into the lives of other remarkable women of the Bible? Our ebook, The Virtues of Women in the Bible, Timeless Lessons from Modern Life, offers powerful insights into how women like Hannah, Esther, Abigail, Ruth, and Mary faced immense challenges with grace, wisdom, and perseverance. Let their timeless virtues inspire your faith and guide your journey. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the first pinned comment to access this life-changing ebook today and start transforming your own story.